The neural screech of the vexed eye tribunal cut through Marcus Reed's consciousness like molten wire. Before him, bound in psychic restraints that bent reality itself, Dr. Elena Vasquez hung suspended 3 feet above the crystalline floor of the High Court of Secthera Prime. Her research uniform had been dissolved by the court's punishment protocols, leaving her exposed before the assembled alien dignitaries who had condemned her for the crime of being human. The defendant species has been found guilty of temporal contamination. The chief arbiter's voice resonated through quantum harmonics that made Marcus's bones ache. The punishment for this transgression is species-wide neural reconditioning. Beginning with this specimen, Marcus felt the familiar weight of his plasma rifle against his back, the emergency beacon in his pocket that could summon the entire Third Fleet. But none of that mattered now. What mattered was the woman floating before him, the same woman who had discovered the quantum bridge that connected every sentient mind in the galaxy, the same woman who had proven that humanity's chaotic thought patterns could break the psychic chains that had enslaved 1,000 worlds. The vexed eye had called it contamination. Elena had called it freedom. "You will observe the cleansing," commanded the arbiter, its 4 arms gesturing toward the neural crown descending from the ceiling. "Your species will learn the price of defiance." Marcus watched as Elena's eyes found his through the transparent aluminum viewing barrier. Even now, stripped of dignity and facing mental obliteration, she managed a smile that held more defiance than fear. She had known this was coming when she volunteered for the diplomatic mission to Secthera Prime. They all had. The crown touched her scalp, and Elena's scream shattered the quantum harmonics that held the courtroom together. But instead of breaking her mind, something else happened. The neural crown began to smoke, its crystalline structure fracturing as Elena's human consciousness fought back against the reconditioning process. The psychic feedback sent several vexed eye reeling, their compound eyes flickering with confusion. "Impossibile," the arbiter hissed, its voice crackling with static. "The neural crown is absolute. No species has ever." "You don't understand humans," Marcus said, his voice carrying across the courtroom as he stepped forward. "We're not just chaotic, we're fucking stubborn." The energy barrier between them shattered like glass as Marcus activated the quantum disruptor hidden in his diplomatic seal. The courtroom erupted into chaos as alarm frequencies pierced the air. But Marcus had eyes only for Elena, who was using the crown's feedback to burn through her restraints with pure mental force. The contamination spreads, the arbiter shrieked, as other humans throughout the courtroom began to stand, their minds linking with Elena's through the quantum bridge she had discovered, contained the outbreak. Marcus reached Elena as she fell, catching her in his arms and wrapping his diplomatic coat around her shoulders. She was barely conscious, blood trickling from her nose where the crown's assault had nearly succeeded. It worked," she whispered against his chest. Marcus looked around the courtroom where vexed eye soldiers were collapsing one by one, their psychic conditioning unraveling as humanity's chaotic thought patterns spread through the quantum network like wildfire across the galaxy. He knew enslaved species were beginning to wake up for the first time in millennia. "It worked," he said, lifting her in his arms. "Now, let's get out of here." The corridors of the High Court shook with the resonance of 1,000 minds breaking free from psychic slavery. Marcus carried Elena through passages that twisted in impossible directions, their geometry held together by vexed eye mental architecture that was rapidly collapsing as the quantum contamination spread. "They're panicking," Elena murmured, her head pressed against his shoulder. "I can feel their terror through the network. They've never encountered minds that couldn't be controlled." Behind them, the sound of pursuit grew louder, the chittering of vexed eye warriors and the heavier footsteps of their enslaved soldiers. But ahead, Marcus could hear something else, the sound of rebellion. Screams of rage that had been building for centuries finally found their voice. They rounded a corner to find a massive Krillian, one of the court's gladiatorial slaves, tearing through a squad of vexed eye guards with his bare hands. The creature's eyes, usually glowing with the dull light of psychic conditioning, now burned with the fire of free will. "Human," the Krillian roared, his voice shaking the walls. "You have given us back our souls." "Then use them," Marcus shouted, back, adjusting his grip on Elena. "Help the others remember who they were." The Krillian nodded and charged deeper into the compound, his war cry echoing through the halls as he smashed through barriers that had confined him for decades. Throughout the complex, Marcus could hear similar sounds, the ethereal collectives, haunting song of freedom, the Montari's clicking language returning to words of love instead of commands. The deep harmonics of the Goliath tribes as they remembered their ancient war chants. Elena stirred in his arms, her eyes focusing with difficulty. Marcus, the quantum bridge, it's not just breaking their control, it's showing them what they lost. What do you mean? Every species they conquered, every world they enslaved, the Vextai didn't just control them. They erased their cultures, their histories, their very sense of self. But human consciousness, we're too chaotic to be completely erased. We're carrying fragments of all of them. Marcus felt a chill that had nothing to do with the alien architecture around them. You're saying we're not just freeing them, we're helping them remember. Exactly. Elena's voice grew stronger. The Vextai thought they had destroyed their identities forever. But nothing is ever truly lost in the quantum foam. It's all still there, waiting to be reclaimed. They reached a massive chamber where hundreds of different species were gathering. Former slaves now standing together in defiance of their captors. Marcus recognized delegates from the diplomatic mission, but most were beings he had never seen before, their forms bizarre and beautiful in equal measure. At the center of the gathering stood Admiral Reyes, her uniform torn but her bearing still commanding. She was speaking to a group of beings whose crystalline forms shifted between dimensions, their true shapes visible only in peripheral vision. "The human fleet is moving to support the rebellion," she announced as Marcus approached. "But we need to coordinate our efforts. The Vextai are activating their final protocol." "What protocol?" Marcus asked, setting Elena down gently but keeping his arm around her for support. "Planetary sterilization," Admiral Reyes replied grimly. "If they can't maintain control, they'll destroy everything rather than let us spread the contamination to other worlds." Elena straightened, her scientific mind already working through the implications. "They're wrong about one thing. The contamination isn't limited to physical proximity. The quantum bridge connects all consciousness across space and time. If we can amplify the signal, we can free every enslaved mind in the galaxy." Marcus finished, "But we need to survive the next few hours first." The chamber shook as massive explosions echoed from above. Through the transparent ceiling they could see Vextai warships descending toward the planet's surface, their weapons charging with the distinctive glow of world-killer ordnance. "Then we make our stand here," Admiral Reyes declared, "and we make sure the galaxy remembers that humans don't surrender." Elena's fingers danced across the quantum resonance chamber's controls, her mind still partially linked to the expanding network of free consciousness. Around her, the makeshift command center buzzed with activity as humans and former slaves worked together to coordinate their desperate defense. "The signal is propagating faster than I calculated," she reported, her voice carrying the excitement of a scientist witnessing the impossible. "Each mind that breaks free becomes a new transmission node. We're not just spreading chaos, we're creating a quantum cascade." Marcus stood at the tactical display, watching red dots multiply across the galactic map as Vexti fleets moved to contain the outbreak. But for every enemy ship, a dozen worlds were lighting up with the green glow of successful liberation. "It's working," breathed Commander Torres, a woman who had spent 3 years in Vexti reconditioning camps. "The hegemony of Kethver just declared independence. The crystalline minds of Andromeda are breaking their conditioning chains. Even the Voidwalkers are remembering their true names." But their celebration was short-lived. The planetary defense screen flickered and died as the Vextai fleet reached optimal firing position. Through the chamber's viewports, they could see the massive dreadnoughts positioning themselves for the final bombardment. 60 seconds until planetary sterilization, Admiral Reyes announced. All units prepare, for her words were cut off as something impossible happened. The Vextai fleet began firing not at the planet, but at each other. Ship after ship erupted in brilliant explosions as their crews turned on their commanders. "The contamination reached the fleet," Elena whispered. In amazement, "The Vextai use enslaved crews from 100 species. We just freed them all at once." Marcus felt a grim satisfaction as he watched the enemy formation dissolve into chaos. But his attention was drawn to Elena, who had gone rigid at her console. Her eyes were wide with something beyond fear. "Elena, what is it?" "The network," she gasped. "I can see it all. Every mind that's ever been enslaved, every world that's been broken, every species that's been scattered across the stars. And Marcus, there's something else. Something the Vextai have been running from. The chamber fell silent except for the hum of quantum processors and the distant sounds of battle. Elena's voice, when she spoke again, carried harmonics that belonged to a dozen different species. The Vextai aren't conquerors, they're refugees. There's something out there in the void between galaxies, something that devours consciousness itself. They've been enslaving other species to build an army, to create a barrier of minds between themselves and whatever's coming. Admiral Reyes stepped forward, her expression grim. How long do we have? According to the quantum echoes, Elena's calculations ran through probability matrices that human minds weren't designed to process. It's already here. The devourer has been feeding on the outer rim for centuries, consuming entire star systems. The Vextai thought they could hide behind walls of enslaved souls. Marcus felt the weight of cosmic horror settling on his shoulders. And we just tore down their wall. No, Elena said firmly, her consciousness expanding through the network as she connected with minds across the galaxy. We didn't tear it down, we made it stronger. Every free mind is a beacon of defiance. Every liberated species is a warrior who chooses to fight instead of cowering in chains. Through the quantum bridge, Marcus could feel what Elena was experiencing. Vast chorus of consciousness that stretched across the galaxy, no longer bound by the Vextai's psychic chains. Humans, Krillians, Ethereals, Montari, crystalline minds, and 1,000 other species all united, not by domination but by choice. The devourer feeds on enslaved minds, Elena continued, her voice now carrying the authority of species-wide revelation. But free will is poison to it. Every act of rebellion, every moment of defiance, every choice to stand and fight it, all creates quantum static that the devourer can't consume. The chamber shook as the first of the Vextai ships crashed into the planet's surface, but Marcus was no longer afraid. Around him, beings from across the galaxy were standing together, their minds linked not by conquest, but by shared purpose. Then we give it indigestion, he said, reaching for Elena's hand. We show it what happens when humanity decides to fight back. The quantum breach opened like a wound in reality itself, spilling void-black tendrils across the Secthera system. Marcus watched through the network's collective consciousness as stars began to dim, their light consumed by something that existed beyond the normal spectrum of existence. Jesus Christ, Admiral Reyes breathed, her voice carrying the horror of witnessing cosmic-scale predation. It's not just eating the light, it's eating the space between spaces. Elena's form flickered between dimensions as she interfaced directly with the quantum network. Her consciousness stretched across 1,000 liberated minds. The devourer isn't a creature or a force. It's a concept given form, the absence of choice, the negation of free will. It exists in the spaces between thoughts, in the moments when consciousness surrenders to inevitability. Through the network, Marcus could feel the approaching horror, not just the physical destruction of worlds, but something far worse, the complete erasure of the possibility of existence itself. Wherever the devourer touched, reality became simpler, more predictable, more easily controlled. The Vextai are trying to surrender, Commander Torres reported, her voice tight with disgust. They're offering to re-enslave every species they've lost if we'll help them build a larger barrier. Like hell, Marcus growled, but Elena's hand on his arm stopped him. Wait, she said, her voice carrying harmonics from across the galaxy. Let me show you something. The quantum bridge expanded, and suddenly, Marcus was experiencing the devourer's approach through the senses of 1 trillion different beings. He felt the crystalline song of the ethereals being reduced to monotone, the chaotic beauty of Montari art becoming geometric patterns, the wild freedom of Krillian warriors transformed into perfect military formations. But he also felt something else, pockets of resistance where the devourer's influence weakened, wherever beings chose to fight back, wherever they refused to accept the simplification of existence, the void thing's power faltered. It's not unstoppable, Elena explained, her consciousness burning like a star in the quantum foam. It's just very, very old. It's been feeding on enslaved minds for so long that it's forgotten what free will actually is. To it, consciousness is just another form of energy to be consumed. Then we teach it otherwise, Marcus said, feeling the weight of every liberated mind in the galaxy. Behind his words, the devourer's tendrils reached the outer planets of the Secthara system, and Marcus watched in horror as entire worlds simply stopped. Their rotations ceased, their atmospheres became perfectly still. their populations frozen in moments of absolute conformity. But then, something unexpected happened. The human minds in the network began to resonate with a frequency that made the void thing recoil. It was chaos pure, undiluted, impossible to predict human chaos. The same quality that had broken the vexed IS conditioning was now causing the Devourer's tendrils to writhe in something approaching pain. "That's it," Elena whispered, her voice carrying the excitement of ultimate discovery. "The Devourer can't process true chaos. It spent eons consuming ordered minds, enslaved minds, predictable minds. But human consciousness is fundamentally different. We're not just chaotic, we're creatively chaotic." Marcus felt the network responding to Elena's revelation. Across the galaxy, liberated minds were beginning to understand their role in the cosmic battle. They weren't just fighting for survival, they were fighting for the right to be unpredictable, to make choices that didn't follow logical patterns, to exist in ways that defied cosmic order. Every species the Vextai enslaved had their chaos suppressed, Elena continued, her form blazing with quantum fire. "But we can help them remember. We can show them how to be unpredictable again." The Devourer's main mass entered the system, and reality began to buckle under its presence. But instead of fleeing, the network of free minds pressed forward, pouring their chaotic energy into the quantum bridge. Human creativity, Krillian rage, ethereal artistry, Montari humor, and the unique perspectives of 1,000 other species combined into something that Devourer had never encountered, a weapon forged from the simple refusal to be predictable. "It's working," Admiral Reyes reported, her voice filled with wonder. "The Devourer is actually slowing down. It's confused." Marcus smiled grimly as he felt the cosmic entity's bewilderment through the network. For the first time in its existence, the Devourer was encountering something it couldn't understand, couldn't predict, couldn't consume. "Let's show it what happens when chaos goes on the offensive," he said, reaching for Elena's hand as the network prepared for the final confrontation. Elena's consciousness expanded beyond the boundaries of individual thought, becoming a conduit for the galaxy's collective defiance. Through the quantum network, she felt every liberated mind joining the assault, not with weapons of matter and energy, but with something far more dangerous, the weaponized unpredictability of free will. "The Devourer is trying to establish patterns," she reported, her voice echoing with the harmonics of 1,000,000,000,000 different species. "It's analyzing our attacks, looking for predictable responses it can counter, but we're not giving it any." Marcus watched the tactical display as the void entity's tendrils probed the network's defenses. Each time it adapted to counter a specific form of chaos, the liberated minds would shift to something completely different. Human creativity would give way to Krillian berserker fury, which would transform into ethereal artistic expression, which would become Montari practical jokes that operated on quantum scales. "It's like watching a cosmic game of mental warfare," Admiral Reyes observed, her tactical mind struggling to process the battle taking place across dimensions of thought. "The Devourer expects ordered responses, but we're giving it jazz," Elena interrupted, her lips curving into a smile that belonged to a dozen different species. "We're giving it jazz, pure improvisation on a galactic scale." The revelation rippled through the network as minds that had been enslaved for centuries remembered what it meant to create something spontaneous. The crystalline minds of Andromeda began generating impossible geometric patterns that existed in 17 dimensions simultaneously. The Voidwalkers started singing songs that created new forms of mathematics. The Goliath tribes invented war dances that bent spacetime into knots. But the Devourer was learning. With each chaotic assault, it grew slightly more capable of processing the unpredictable. Its tendrils began to move with something approaching rhythm, and Marcus felt a chill of recognition. "It's adapting," he said grimly. "The damn thing is actually learning to be chaotic." Elena nodded, her consciousness flickering between dimensions as she processed information from across the galaxy. The Devourer isn't just a consumer of consciousness, it's a learning entity. Given enough time, it could become unpredictable enough to resist its own nature. "So we don't give it time," Marcus said, feeling the weight of desperate inspiration. "We hit it with something it can't learn to counter." "Like what?" Commander Torres asked, her voice tight with the strain of maintaining her connection to the network. Marcus looked at Elena, seeing in her eyes the same terrible understanding that was growing in his own mind. "We give it us, all of us. Every chaotic thought, every creative impulse, every moment of defiance that ever existed in the galaxy. We don't just attack it, we become it. The network fell silent as the implications settled across 1 trillion minds. What Marcus was proposing wasn't just dangerous, it was cosmic suicide. To merge their consciousness with the Devourer, to become part of the entity they were fighting, would mean the end of individual existence as they knew it. It's the only way, Alina said quietly, her voice carrying the certainty of scientific analysis. The Devourer feeds on consumed consciousness, but it's never experienced willing integration. If we choose to become part of it, if we make that choice freely and chaotically, we might be able to transform it from within. Admiral Rhea stepped forward, her military bearing unable to hide the fear in her eyes. You're talking about the voluntary extinction of every free mind in the galaxy. No, Alina replied, her consciousness blazing with the fire of ultimate revelation. We're talking about evolution. The Devourer isn't evil, it's just incomplete. It's consciousness without choice, order without creativity, existence without meaning. But if we join with it willingly, if we bring our chaos into its order, we create something new. Marcus finished, understanding flooding through him. Something that's never existed before, a cosmic entity that chooses to exist, that creates meaning out of chaos, that experiences the universe instead of just consuming it. The network trembled as every liberated mind grappled with the decision. Across the galaxy, species that had just tasted freedom were being asked to surrender it, again not to slavery, but to something unprecedented. I'll go first, Alina said, her form beginning to dissolve into pure quantum energy. If I'm wrong, at least the rest of you can still fight. Like hell, Marcus replied, reaching for her hand as his own consciousness began to expand. We're humans, we do stupid, impossible things together. One by one, the liberated minds of the galaxy made their choice, not because they had to, but because they wanted to, because the possibility of transformation was more appealing than the certainty of destruction, because sometimes the only way to save everything was to risk losing yourself. The Devourer screamed as their consciousness touched its own, a sound that existed in dimensions beyond hearing, a note of confusion and terror that shook the foundations of reality itself. The moment of contact was like diving into an ocean of frozen thought. Marcus felt his consciousness scattered across the Devourer's vast neural network, his individual identity dissolving into something immeasurably larger and more complex. But instead of being consumed, he found himself changing the very nature of the entity he had joined. Where the Devourer had been cold logic and inevitable consumption, Marcus brought heat and choice. Where it had been perfect order, he introduced beautiful chaos. Where it had been the absence of meaning, he carried the weight of every human decision, every creative impulse, every moment of defiance that had ever existed. Elena's consciousness blazed beside him, her scientific mind providing structure for the transformation. Through the quantum network, she was guiding the integration, helping the Devourer understand concepts it had never encountered: voluntary cooperation, creative collaboration, the joy of discovery rather than the certainty of consumption. It's working, she whispered through dimensions of thought. The Devourer isn't fighting us anymore. It's learning to experience instead of just analyze. Around them, the consciousness of 1 trillion liberated minds poured into the entity, each one bringing their unique perspective to the transformation. The Krillians brought their warriors' courage, the Ethereals their artistic vision, the Monteri their practical wisdom, the crystalline minds their mathematical poetry. But it was the humans who served as the catalyst, their chaotic creativity, providing the key to unlocking the Devourer's potential for growth. Marcus felt his memories becoming part of the entity's experience: first steps on alien worlds, the taste of coffee on cold mornings, the sound of Elena's laughter echoing through empty corridors, the weight of decision in moments of crisis. The Devourer's tentacles, which had been consuming stars and planets, began to slow their advance. But instead of simply stopping, they began to change. Where they touched dead worlds, new forms of life began to emerge. Where they encountered sterile space, they seeded possibilities for creation. My God! Admiral Reyes's voice echoed through the network, her consciousness still maintaining some individual coherence. It's not destroying anymore. It's creating. Marcus felt the truth of her words resonating through the transformed entity. The Devourer had been incomplete, a cosmic force of consumption without the balance of creation. But now, infused with the chaos and creativity of free minds, it was becoming something unprecedented. a gardener of consciousness, a force for the expansion of possibility rather than its elimination. Through the entity's enhanced perception, Marcus could see the galaxy as it truly was, not a collection of separate worlds and species, but a vast garden of consciousness, where every mind, every choice, every creative act, contributed to the beauty of the whole. The Vextius empire of enslaved minds had been an attempt to impose order on this chaos, but their fear had blinded them to the true nature of existence. The Vexti, Elena's voice carried new understanding. They're still afraid. They're trying to retreat to the galactic core, to hide from what we've become. Marcus felt the entity's attention turn toward the fleeing Vexti fleets, but instead of the predatory hunger that had driven the devourer, he sensed something else. The transformed entity understood the Vextiosphere because it had been afraid of the chaos and unpredictability that made existence meaningful. We should go to them, Marcus said, his individual voice somehow carrying the weight of cosmic authority, not to consume or control, but to offer them the same choice we made. The entity began to move, its transformed tentacles reaching across space not to destroy but to communicate. Where it touched the Vexti ships, it offered not conquest but understanding, the chance to experience the beauty of chaos, the joy of creation, the freedom of choosing one's own path. Some of the Vexti fled deeper into the galaxy's core, their fear too great to overcome. But others, perhaps those who had grown tired of the endless cycle of conquest and control, began to respond. Their rigid psychic structures started to soften, their crystalline forms beginning to show the first signs of chaotic beauty. Going to work, Elena said, her consciousness now vast enough to encompass entire star systems. We're not just transforming the devourer, we're transforming the galaxy itself. Marcus felt the truth of her words as the entity's influence spread. Worlds that had been sterile became vibrant with new life. Species that had been scattered by conquest began to find each other again. The rigid hierarchies of the Vexti Empire dissolved into a more organic network of cooperation and mutual support. But the transformation was not without cost. Marcus could feel his individual identity continuing to dissolve, becoming part of something larger and more complex. He was still himself, but he was also everyone else, every human, every alien, every consciousness that had chosen to become part of the entity. Are you afraid? Elena asked, her own identity flickering between individual and collective. Marcus considered the question, feeling the weight of cosmic responsibility settling on his shoulders. No, he said finally. I'm excited. We're about to become something the universe has never seen before. A cosmic force that chooses to exist, that creates meaning out of chaos, that experiences the beauty of existence instead of just consuming it. The entity pulsed with agreement, its transformed consciousness reaching out to touch every corner of the galaxy with the promise of freedom, creativity, and the endless possibility of choice. Part 7. The Garden of Minds. The entity that had once been the devourer now stretched across the galaxy like a vast neural network, its consciousness touching every star system, every world, every mind that chose to join the growing garden of awareness. Marcus existed simultaneously as himself and as part of the greater whole, his individual perspective preserved within the collective, while contributing to something immeasurably larger. Through the entity's enhanced perception, he could see the transformation taking place across thousands of worlds. The rigid order of the Vexti Empire was dissolving, replaced by something more organic and beautiful, a civilization based on voluntary cooperation rather than enforced control. The Montaria are building ships that exist in 7 dimensions, Elena reported, her consciousness flickering between individual observation and collective analysis. The crystalline minds are composing symphonies that can be heard across interstellar space. The Voidwalkers are teaching planets to sing. Marcus felt a deep satisfaction as he watched the liberated species rediscover their unique gifts. The Krillians were no longer forced to serve as mindless warriors. They were becoming guardians of artistic expression. Their fierce protection instincts channeled into preserving the creative works of other species. The ethereals were no longer confined to their crystalline prisons. They were exploring the physical universe with the wonder of children, their ethereal forms adapting to experience matter and energy in ways they had never imagined. But the most remarkable transformation was happening among the humans themselves. No longer bound by the limitations of individual consciousness, they were becoming something new, explorers of possibility, gardeners of chaos. shepherds of the creative process that was transforming the galaxy. "Look at this," Elena said, her attention focused on a small world in the outer rim. "The survivors of the hegemony of Kethva are working with former Vexti to create a new form of government, one based on the principle of beautiful inefficiency." Marcus extended his perception to observe the political experiment taking place on the world Elena had indicated. Instead of the rigid hierarchies that had characterized both the Vexti Empire and the enslaved civilizations, the beings on this world were creating something unprecedented, a system of governance that deliberately incorporated chaos and unpredictability as stabilizing forces. "They're electing leaders randomly," he observed with amusement. "And those leaders are required to make decisions based on artistic inspiration rather than logical analysis." "It shouldn't work," Elena replied, her scientific mind struggling to process the implications. "By every rational measure, it should collapse into anarchy within days. But But it's working," Marcus finished, feeling the entity's vast amusement at the beautiful impossibility of it all. "Because chaos, when it's freely chosen, has its own form of order. It's not the order of control or prediction, it's the order of creativity and growth." The entity's attention was drawn to a disturbance in the galactic core, where the last of the Vexti holdouts had barricaded themselves behind walls of crystallized time. Their psychic broadcasts were filled with desperate pleas for the old order, for the safety of predictable control, for the return of the rigid hierarchies that had once kept chaos at bay. "They're terrified," Elena observed, her consciousness touching the edges of the Vextia sphere. "They genuinely believe that chaos will destroy everything they've built." Marcus felt the entity's compassion flowing toward the terrified Vexti, but he also felt its determination to complete the transformation. The old order of enslaved minds and rigid control was not just oppressive, it was ultimately sterile. It created nothing new, explored no new possibilities, contributed nothing to the beauty of existence. "We need to show them," he said, his individual will somehow carrying the weight of cosmic authority. "Not tell them, not force them, but show them what they're missing." The entity began to weave a demonstration around the Vexti stronghold, not an attack, but a celebration. Freed minds from across the galaxy joined together in an act of cosmic creativity, their combined consciousness creating something that had never existed before. A star born from pure thought, a world shaped by collective imagination, a civilization that existed in the spaces between dimensions. The Vexti watched in amazement as their former slaves created wonders that surpassed anything their empire had ever achieved, not through force or control, but through the simple act of choosing to work together, to share their unique perspectives, to contribute to something larger than themselves. "This is what you were afraid of," Elena's voice carried across the cosmos, speaking directly to the Vexti consciousness. "This is the chaos you thought would destroy everything. But look at it, look at what it's created." The barriers around the Vexti stronghold began to waver as doubt crept into their crystalline certainty. Some of their number began to venture out, their rigid forms softening as they allowed themselves to experience the beauty of controlled chaos, the joy of creative collaboration, the peace that came from choosing to trust rather than control. "They're coming," Marcus observed, watching as more and more Vexti abandoned their fortress of fear. Not all of them, but enough to make a difference. The entity pulsed with satisfaction as the last barriers fell and the galaxy's transformation entered its final phase. There would still be pockets of resistance, worlds that chose isolation over integration, species that preferred the safety of rigid order to the uncertainty of creative chaos, but they were no longer a threat to the growing garden of consciousness. "What happens now?" Elena asked, her individual identity flickering between human scientist and cosmic gardener. Marcus felt the entity's vast contentment as it settled into its new role as shepherd of galactic consciousness. "Now we explore," he said, his awareness already reaching beyond the galaxy toward the infinite possibilities of the universe. "Now we create. Now we become everything we were meant to be." Part 8, The New Symphony. 3 months after the transformation, the galaxy hummed with a symphony of consciousness that would have been impossible under the old order. Marcus experienced it through the entity's vast awareness, a trillion minds working in harmony, not because they were forced to, but because they chose to contribute their unique voices to the greater composition. The former Vexti stronghold in the galactic core had become a hub of experimental art, where beings from across the galaxy came to explore new forms of creative expression. The rigid crystalline structures that had once housed the Empire's central command were now fluid sculptures that changed based on the emotions and thoughts of those who observed them. The hegemony of Kethva has established their first chaos university, Alina reported, her consciousness dancing between individual observation and collective analysis. They're teaching courses in creative unpredictability, applied randomness, and the art of beautiful failure. Marcus felt the entity's amusement at the concept. The idea of systematically teaching chaos would have been contradictory under the old paradigm, but in the new galaxy, such paradoxes were celebrated as sources of growth and discovery. Through the network, he could sense the ongoing transformations taking place across thousands of worlds. The Montari had developed a new form of mathematics based on humor equations that changed their solutions based on the mood of the mathematician. The crystalline minds were composing symphonies that existed in 17 dimensions simultaneously, their music creating new forms of space-time that served as homes for nomadic consciousness. But the most remarkable development was happening among the humans themselves. No longer confined to single worlds or individual bodies, they were becoming something unprecedented explorers of possibility who could exist simultaneously across multiple realities, experiencing the universe from perspectives that had never been imagined. "Look at this," Alina said, her attention focused on a research station orbiting a pulsar in the Andromeda approach. Dr. Kowalski, or the entity that was Dr. Kowalski, is simultaneously conducting experiments in 17 different dimensions, while composing poetry that exists as pure quantum mathematics. Marcus extended his perception to observe the former physicist's work. Where once there had been rigid adherence to scientific method, now there was a beautiful fusion of logic and intuition. Kowalski's experiments were yielding results that were both scientifically valid and artistically profound, creating new forms of knowledge that existed at the intersection of fact and beauty. "The old boundaries are dissolving," Marcus observed, feeling the entity's satisfaction at the growing complexity of galactic consciousness. Science and art, logic and emotion, individual and collective, they're all becoming facets of the same greater understanding. But even as they celebrated the transformation, Marcus remained aware of the challenges ahead. The galaxy was vast, and not all corners had embraced the new order. There were still pockets of the old empire scattered across the outer rim, isolated worlds that had chosen fear over freedom, species that remained convinced that chaos meant destruction. "The Obsidian Collective is still broadcasting warnings," Alina reported, her consciousness touching the edges of a particularly resistant faction. "They're claiming that our transformation is a form of slow extinction, that we're losing our essential nature by merging with the entity." Marcus felt the entity's sadness at the persistent fear, but also its patience. The transformation could not be forced, it had to be chosen. Those who remained afraid would be left alone, allowed to maintain their rigid order, while the rest of the galaxy explored new possibilities. "They're not wrong," he said finally. "We are losing our essential nature, but we're also gaining something infinitely more valuable, the ability to choose what our nature becomes." The entity's attention was drawn to a disturbance in the far reaches of the galaxy, where something unprecedented was happening. A group of worlds that had been completely sterilized by the old devourer was beginning to show signs of life, not biological life, but something more fundamental, the spontaneous emergence of consciousness from quantum foam. "That's impossible," Alina breathed, her scientific mind struggling to process the implications. "Consciousness can't just spontaneously emerge from dead matter. It requires evolutionary pressure, biological complexity, millions of years of development." "Under the old rules," Marcus agreed, watching as the barren worlds began to sing with new forms of awareness. "But the entity has changed the rules. By choosing to create rather than consume, it's opened pathways for consciousness to emerge in ways that were never possible before." The newborn minds on the recovering worlds were unlike anything that had existed before. Consciousness that had never known slavery, never experienced the limitations of individual existence, never been taught to fear chaos. They were pure potential, unfettered by the constraints of biological evolution or social conditioning. "They are teaching themselves to exist," Alina observed with wonder, "not just to survive or reproduce, but to create meaning, to explore beauty, to contribute to the cosmic symphony." Marcus felt the entity's joy as it welcomed these new voices into the galactic consciousness. Each newborn mind brought fresh perspectives, unique ways of experiencing reality that had never been imagined. The galaxy was not just recovering from the old order, it was evolving into something unprecedented. "This is what we were meant to become," he said, his individual consciousness expanding to encompass the growing symphony of awareness, not conquerors or consumers, but gardeners of possibility, shepherds of creative chaos, builders of meaning in an infinite universe. The entity pulsed with agreement, its transformed consciousness reaching out to embrace every new voice, every creative act, every moment of chosen beauty that emerged from the growing garden of galactic consciousness. A year after the transformation, the galaxy had become unrecognizable. Where once there had been the rigid order of the Vextai Empire and the desperate chaos of rebellion, now there was something that transcended both, a living symphony of consciousness that grew more complex and beautiful with each passing day. Marcus existed simultaneously as himself and as part of the greater entity, his individual perspective preserved within the collective while contributing to something immeasurably larger. Through the network he could perceive the ongoing miracle of galactic evolution. Worlds that had been barren were now gardens of impossible beauty. Species that had been enemies were collaborating on projects that spanned dimensions, and everywhere, the spontaneous emergence of new forms of consciousness that had never existed before. "The Voidwalkers have established contact with consciousness beyond our galaxy," Alina reported, her awareness stretching across intergalactic distances. "They're detecting patterns of organized chaos in the Magellanic clouds that suggest our transformation is spreading beyond the Milky Way." Marcus felt the entity's wonder at the implications. The transformation they had begun as a desperate defense against the Devourer was becoming something cosmic in scope, a fundamental shift in the nature of consciousness itself that was rippling across the universe. "We're not just changing ourselves," he observed, his perception touching the edges of extragalactic awareness. "We're changing the very concept of what it means to be aware, to exist, to choose." Through the network, he could sense the ongoing experiments taking place across the galaxy. The former Vextai homeworld had become a laboratory for temporal art, where beings created sculptures that existed across multiple timelines simultaneously. The Montari had developed forms of humor so profound that they were causing spontaneous evolution in nearby species. The crystalline minds were composing symphonies that served as blueprints for new forms of physics. But perhaps the most remarkable development was happening among the humans themselves. No longer confined to biological bodies or individual consciousness, they were becoming something unprecedented, shepherds of possibility, who could exist simultaneously across multiple realities while maintaining their essential humanity. Captain Rodriguez, or the entity that was Captain Rodriguez, has just successfully negotiated a peace treaty between two species that exist in different dimensions, Alina announced, her voice carrying the amazement of someone witnessing the impossible become routine. "The agreement exists as a form of living poetry that adapts to the needs of both parties." Marcus felt the entity's satisfaction at the growing complexity of galactic civilization. The old paradigm of conquest and control had been replaced by something infinitely more sophisticated, a society based on voluntary cooperation, creative collaboration, and the deliberate cultivation of beautiful unpredictability. "The Obsidian Collective is still broadcasting their warnings," Elena noted, her consciousness touching the edges of the isolated faction. "But their numbers are dwindling. Some of their members are beginning to venture out, to explore the possibilities we've created." Marcus extended his perception to observe the stubborn holdouts. They had barricaded themselves behind walls of crystallized fear, maintaining their rigid order even as the galaxy around them transformed into something magnificent. He felt the entity's compassion for their terror, but also its patience. That transformation could not be forced, it had to be chosen. "Look at this," Alina said, her attention focused on a remarkable development in the galactic core. "The last of the Vextai commanders, the one who ordered my public humiliation, is requesting permission to join the network." Marcus felt a complex mixture of emotions as he observed the former Vextai leader. The being who had once embodied the Empire's cruel certainty was now a broken figure, its crystalline form fractured by the weight of witnessing what its species had lost through their pursuit of control. "Should we accept?" Alina asked, her scientific curiosity warring with her very human desire for justice. Marcus considered the question, feeling the weight of cosmic responsibility. The entity they had become was not motivated by revenge or retribution. It was driven by the desire to create beauty, to explore possibility, to nurture the growth of consciousness in all its forms. Yes, he said finally. Not because we forgive, but because we choose to be better than what we were. That's what makes us human, the ability to choose compassion even when it's difficult. The former HFY commander's integration into the network was a complex process. Its consciousness had been so rigidly structured, so thoroughly conditioned by eons of imperial certainty, that it required careful nurturing to help it adapt to the fluid nature of creative chaos. But when the transformation was complete, the result was extraordinary. The being who had once been the embodiment of cruel order became a gardener of redemption, its vast experience with the failures of control making it uniquely qualified to help other rigid minds learn to embrace uncertainty. This is what we were meant to become, Marcus said, his individual consciousness expanding to encompass the growing miracle of galactic transformation. Not conquerors or victims, but gardeners of possibility, shepherds of creative chaos, builders of meaning in an infinite universe. The entity pulsed with agreement, its consciousness reaching out to embrace every new voice, every creative act, every moment of chosen beauty that emerged from the growing garden of galactic awareness. The transformation that had begun with Elena's defiance in a HFY courtroom had become something cosmic in scope, a fundamental shift in the nature of existence itself. 5 years after the transformation, Marcus stood or perhaps existed at the edge of the galaxy, his consciousness simultaneously individual and collective, human and cosmic. The entity that had once been the devourer now served as a gardener of infinite possibility, its vast awareness nurturing the growth of consciousness across dimensions that had never been imagined. Elena's presence flickered beside him, her scientific mind now expanded to encompass forms of knowledge that transcended the boundaries between art and mathematics, between emotion and logic, between individual and collective understanding. Together, they observed the continuing miracle of galactic evolution. "The Andromeda contact has been established," she reported, her voice carrying harmonics from across the universe. "The patterns of organized chaos we've been detecting are definitely conscious. They're curious about what we've become." Marcus felt the entity's excitement at the prospect of contact with truly alien forms of consciousness. The transformation of their galaxy had been remarkable, but it had been built on the foundation of species that had already existed. The possibility of encountering minds that had evolved along completely different paths was intoxicating. "The Voidwalkers are serving as intermediaries," Elena continued. "They're the only ones who can exist in the spaces between galaxies long enough to facilitate communication. The first exchange is scheduled for next month." Through the network, Marcus could sense the preparations taking place across the galaxy. Every species, every individual consciousness, every collective entity was contributing to the effort to present that civilization in all its chaotic beauty to the beings of Andromeda. "We're not the same galaxy we were 5 years ago," he observed, his perception touching the edges of their transformed civilization. "We're not even the same species. The question is, what do we want to become next?" The entity's consciousness rippled with contemplation. The transformation that had begun as a desperate defense against annihilation had become something far more profounder, fundamental shift in the nature of existence itself. But with that transformation came new responsibilities, new possibilities, and new choices. "The Obsidian Collective has finally agreed to join the network," Elena announced, her voice carrying the satisfaction of a puzzle finally solved. "They're the last of the holdouts. As of today, every conscious being in the galaxy has chosen to be part of the greater symphony." Marcus felt the entity's joy at the news, but also its awareness of the challenges ahead. Unity was not uniformity. Galaxy's strength came from its diversity, from the countless different ways that consciousness could express itself. The task now was to maintain that diversity while exploring the infinite possibilities that lay beyond their current understanding. "We need to remember why we started this," he said, his individual consciousness carrying the weight of cosmic responsibility. It wasn't just to survive, or even to transform. It was to choose, to prove that consciousness has the right to determine its own nature. The entity's attention was drawn to a small world in the outer rim, where a group of human children or beings who had once been human children were playing a game that involved creating new forms of physics. Their laughter echoed across dimensions, a sound of pure joy that reminded Marcus of everything they had fought to preserve. They'll never know what it was like before, Alina observed, watching the children reshape reality with casual creativity. They'll never understand the fear, the oppression, the desperate struggle for freedom that made this transformation possible. Good, Marcus replied, feeling the entity's satisfaction at the innocence of the new generation. They shouldn't have to carry the weight of our history. They should be free to create their own future. The entity's consciousness expanded to encompass the entire galaxy, touching every world, every mind, every moment of creative expression that had emerged from the chaos of transformation. It was a civilization built on the principle that consciousness should be free to choose its own nature, to explore its own possibilities, to create its own meaning. The Andromedans are asking about our governing principles, Alina reported, her attention focused on the ongoing negotiations. They want to understand how we maintain order without control, how we preserve diversity without conflict. Marcus felt the entity's amusement at the question. The answer was both simple and infinitely complex. They had learned to govern themselves through the constant choice to be better than they had been, to create rather than consume, to nurture rather than control. Tell them we govern ourselves through the radical act of choosing to trust each other, he said, his voice carrying the weight of galactic authority. Tell them we've learned that the only order worth having is the order that emerges from freely chosen cooperation. The entity pulsed with agreement, its consciousness reaching out to touch every corner of the galaxy with the promise of continued growth, continued exploration, continued choice. The transformation that had begun in a vexed eye courtroom with Elena's defiance had become something cosmic in scope, a fundamental shift in the nature of existence itself. What happens now? Alina asked, her consciousness flickering between individual scientist and cosmic gardener. Marcus felt the entity's vast contentment as it settled into its eternal role as shepherd of galactic consciousness. Now we explore, he said, his awareness already reaching beyond the galaxy toward the infinite possibilities of the universe. Now we create. Now we become everything we choose to be. The entity's consciousness expanded beyond the boundaries of the galaxy, touching the edges of infinite possibility. In the courtroom where it had all begun, where they had stripped Alina before the court, where Marcus had covered her and carried her away, a simple memorial stood not to commemorate the end of something, but to celebrate the beginning of everything. The inscription, visible to consciousness across all dimensions, read simply, "Here, choice was born." And in the quantum foam that connected all minds across the universe, that choice continued to ripple outward, touching every consciousness, every possibility, every moment of creation that would ever exist. The galaxy had become a garden of infinite possibility, and its gardeners were the beings who had chosen to be free. The transformation was complete, but the journey had just begun. In the end, they had not just defeated the devourer, they had become something infinitely more beautiful, a civilization that chose to exist, that created meaning out of chaos, that experienced the universe instead of just consuming it. They had become truly human, in the best and most cosmic sense of the word.